Okay, hello everyone. My name is Cristi Macelaru. I'm the music director of the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music. And we are a festival that focuses on the music of today, focuses on music of composers that actually are able to join us to share in the creative process, in the creation of music of today and for today. I'm joined by three wonderful composers, collaborators that we've had with us in the festival in years past. I have to start with one of our composers that has perhaps been the most featured in Cabrillo, John Corigliano, who is, I think, a household name for anyone that has heard any classical music. I'm also joined by Peter Shin, who was in Cabrillo a couple of years ago, sharing his music, his work on the same concert that we celebrated your 80th birthday, John, at the festival with the piano concerto. And also Gabriella Smith, who was, I think, in my first season in Cabrillo, we had a piece of hers that we performed as well. And this is our way of reaching out to our community, to our followers and our supporters, in being able to recreate in a little way the special magic that happens in Cabrillo, which is we get to meet composers. And we have heard back from so many of our audience members who wanted to get to ask questions, wanted to get to meet our composers that we feature, which is why we started this series as Composers in Conversation. As a reminder, if you have direct questions for any of our composers or even for myself, please feel free to do so at the bottom of the screen. I believe there is a chat function that you can put in questions, and then I will moderate them as they arrive. So for now, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. John, Gabriella, Peter, I'm so happy that you're able to join me. And let's see, perhaps we start with one fun little question. John, if I may start with you. As I said, you have been to Cabrillo actually more times than I have. Because you started coming to Cabrillo many years ago and continued coming back, which we really deeply appreciate. And you have a very special connection with Cabrillo. Can I ask you, how has Cabrillo changed over the years, or how have you seen your returns to Cabrillo?
Well, it's basically hasn't changed, excepting that I think it's gotten better. By that, I mean the interaction of the composers is more. At the beginning, we were all in there and doing it, and it was just starting, and we each one did what we did. But more and more, the composers and Cabrillo get to know each other and have a kind of family association, which is really wonderful between composers. And I think that's happened more in the years that you've taken over and helped grow this thing. So I find it a beautiful place to be.
Thank you. And I know one thing that struck me when I started, when I took over from Marion and I started conducting, was how engaged the audience actually is in feeling very comfortable to reach out to the composers during the rehearsal process, which is not usual, right? Like, you don't really, in a normal setting, the audience is not usually invited to watch the rehearsal process. And I mean, how does that feel as a composer when your piece is being rehearsed? So it's not the final product yet, but you have the audience actually witness the rehearsal process. What do you think?
Well, I think it's very illuminating, because the audience always gives you a feeling during the piece of whether this is going on too long or this is not, etc. But I would say it's a little different with the world premiere. With the world premiere, you have to make every second count and maybe make some changes as we're going, because that's what happens in world premieres. So it's a little more tension, and the audience is okay. But I think it's much better with a piece that's already been performed, in which you are recreating, in which you relax, and the audience, of course, loves to go to rehearsals. I think rehearsals are the most self. I learned so much during rehearsal, not just of my music, but when I hear other people's music, I learn about their pieces, insights, changes that could make it go this way or that way. And there's a lot to learn from the rehearsal process.
Yeah, I agree. The rehearsals are so illuminating, as you said, for me as well, because I don't, it's even more so with brand new music, but even with old music, I can't say that I have 100% the interpretation in my mind before I step onto the podium, because you deal with human beings that it changes, right? The dynamic of how they interact with each other and how we all interact with the music, it changes. And this brings me actually to our first anonymous question for both Gabriella and Peter. I mean, I should say to a question from an anonymous person watching. And they are asking a question, Gabriella and Peter, and it says, it seems your work uses a lot of electronics. Has this increased because of the pandemic, or has your work always been involved so much with electronics? Gabriella, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have written very little for electronics, although I would love to do more. I think people often think that because there's so many sounds that I make in my music that sound electronic. Actually, I remember the first piece I wrote for Cabrillo in 2014. Somebody thought that it was for orchestra and like bird calls, but it's actually just orchestra, and the strings were making all these noises that people weren't used to hearing. So they just assumed that they were, some other sound that couldn't possibly come from an orchestra. So I actually think that's really cool. But actually, because of the pandemic, I have been writing more with electronics. I wrote a piece recently for a friend of mine for his album using Ableton, which is I'd used a little bit before, but mostly thinking about live performance and doing things like that rather than like actual electronic sounds. So yeah, that's been something that I'm newly exploring and really enjoying.
And Peter, how about you?
Yeah, I just have to say, I listened to the promo that you posted on your Instagram, Gabriella. It's so cool. Yeah, I maybe the person who asked this question listened to the 3 samples that I sent in, which I think 2 of them used electronics. But I'm the same way as Gabriella. I haven't really written so much for electronics before. I do want to explore that option more. Actually, my last piece was completely acoustic, and I wanted to use that particular opportunity to write for electronics and take advantage of the pandemic, but I completely went the opposite direction and just happened to go that way.
Yes, both your pieces actually that we performed in Cabrillo were completely acoustic. I remember, in fact, it went the other way around, Gabriella, if I remember correctly, in Field Guide, right? You recorded sounds from nature and then you recreated them in the orchestra, which I thought was fascinating, to be able to come up with a creative way of reproducing a sound that you hear in nature, but in a way that it's not just the bird song, right? Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think I am one of the things I do when I'm not writing music is I love making field recordings of natural soundscapes. But I also am inspired by sounds that people aren't necessarily familiar with in the natural world, like underwater sounds of shrimp crackling and parrotfish eating coral. And so all sorts of those sounds also kind of influence my music. And so I think it's like a little bit like you can still tell that something's there, but it's a little bit less obvious because most people haven't heard those sounds before.
John, I remember, I don't know if you remember this, but when we were rehearsing the piano concerto in Cabrillo, I think at the first rehearsal, after the rehearsal was finished, I asked you, how did it feel? And you said, man, I said, I had so much courage back then when I wrote this music because it's not an easy piece. It's very, very challenging. It's a wonderful piece. I've always loved it. So how does it feel? Because I always wonder about this. I mean, you've written so much music that is basically now in standard repertoire, if I could call it this way. How does it feel? What do you mean about having the courage to write to write more. I know we also had a piece that we were supposed to premiere right in San Francisco that unfortunately because of the pandemic got postponed. But what is that courage that you talk about?
Well, for me, composing is a very scary process. Problem. Uh, I hate composing and I hate not composing. That's my other problem. So when I compose, I'm facing my inadequacies, and I don't have any ideas or any thoughts at all until I get a thought, and with the thought comes technique. So I don't even have technique, which is really a terrible position to be in. And I dread taking a new commission. And then what happens is I have this roller coaster situation I live my entire life with, which is I dread it, I take it, I'm panicked, I have fear and panic through half the piece, maybe 2/3, and then I start feeling better because I see it's a real piece. But I get happier and happier and happier until I'm elated at the end of the piece, and it gets performed, I'm elated, and I rest a little bit, and then I feel guilty for not writing another piece, and I start the whole process over again. So that's the way I compose, and it's a rocky road. And now I'm not taking commissions right now because I think at 83 I'm kind of like I don't know what I want to do with my life. I maybe want to do something with the outdoors, with my other things in my life. But I still pace around and saying, why aren't you composing? It takes a lot of courage to compose in the first place. And when that I had never heard an orchestra play my music, obviously. I mean, it was just, I was in my 20s and I wrote this piece for a big orchestra, and I was scared to death when the first rehearsals came, that it wouldn't do what I thought it was going to do. And I just had to say, okay, I'm going to write this. And things worked out. But there's a scary part to composing, and I think a lot of composers feel the same way. Getting into a piece is scary because there's so many choices, an infinite number of choices. What do you want to do? And if you use, 12 tone, minimalist, tonal, sound design, if you use all these various techniques and you can do any of them, how do you start? So it's those are the big decisions you make at the very beginning, and they're scary. So I think that's what I meant by courage, especially in those days when I never knew that an orchestra could play my music, and then they did.
Yeah. I remember. I think the first time I met you was actually when I was working on the violin concerto with Philip Quint, and I remember looking at this because I had listened to the violin concerto, the wonderful recording with Josh Bell, and I had listened, and I even played the solo caprice, but I remember looking at the score for the first time. And I was absolutely fascinated by the way that you write the music, because it's like the fast movement, especially, where there's so many indications of giving the musicians the freedom to improvise or to write sort of, you give them the range, right?
Right. Controlled Alliatoric is what I call it. It's not just Alliatoric, like draw a line and play what this is. It's controls, but then within the control, if you want a very fast bubbling passage and you want 3 bassoons to do it, or 4 horns or strings, if you write out every note for each player chromatically going in between, say, a flatted fifth, it's a terribly difficult thing for them to play, and you have no control over how long they will take to play it if it's as fast as possible. If you simply draw a box around those notes and then say 3 slashes means as fast as possible, play as fast as possible between those notes, it's controlled aleatoric music, and it sounds like a bubbling hive of bees or something, and it's a very different kind of sound. And those are the sounds I love, getting sounds that the orchestra can do by releasing some of their own imaginations, rather than, in the 20th century, we got so strictly notated that, as Stravinsky said, don't interpret my music, play the notes. And there was a big thing about every single note had the finger the violinist is on, the string the violinist is on, the bowing up, everything was taken care of. And the performers, they said, no place for us. And since my father was a violinist and I loved performances, I said, let's make room like they did in the Baroque. let's make room for the idea of improvisation and give and take and all of that by loosening those barriers, still having control, but loosening. That's, I think, a nice way to approach things if you can.
And for me, as a conductor, I also think that this really gives the freedom to the orchestra to do what they do best. Because so oftentimes what is easy for one person to do, it's very difficult for the next person. And if you give them the freedom to say, look, it needs to sound like this, now find the best way, find your sweet spot to do this, to do this gesture. I think it actually kind of ensures in a way that it's always the best performance that orchestra can give of the work, right?
I didn't start doing that with the piano concerto. That was much earlier. About 1975 is when I started releasing and saying, I'm just going to think of something. I'm not going to even think of 5 lines and 12 pitches. I'm just going to think of things and maybe draw something, find some way to make that sound happen. And sometimes that sound is happening by giving not complete, but freedom to the players to do something. I mean, we all do this. The highest possible note is an arrow pointing up. And what you really get is a high plus, because nobody plays the same notes. But if you wrote out that thing for the players, it would be terribly difficult for the 5th violin to play the high D natural and the 6th violin to play an E flat. It would be impossibly hard. And yet, with these simple new tools, new alphabets, new language, you can release them to really get great sounds.
Yeah. Oftentimes I tell orchestras in rehearsal, when we try to play a passage together that starts on an offbeat, let's say, and it's very fast, and it's not together, I would stop and say, if a composer actually wrote what you're playing, we would never be able to do it. But because, it's just natural that it's out of sync, and then it feels much better. No,
the word asynchronous a lot. If there's a very fast like that, and they're fast as possible, and I put asynchronous. Don't worry about your neighbor. Just play it the way you play it as fast as possible. And you get a great sound because they're both. They can play forte, they can go out and project because they're not scared that they have that terribly difficult lick, the 3rd position up and doing this, Doesn't need to be.
Absolutely. Now, Peter, I remember actually in the piece that I did in Cabrillo, in your piece, you used some of these techniques as well, right? Like there was quite a bit of stuff out there that I remember it required the orchestra to come up with their own ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been relinquishing a lot of the decision-making and power to the players in my music, and that's a lot less work for me. And it results in really fascinating sounds. And, John was talking about experiencing a premiere. It's so different from a piece that's been performed a lot. And I love experiencing a premiere because it's the first time when musicians and the conductor make of the music what they will. And that tells me that they're engaged with it when they come to me with ideas. And I remember, Cristi, there was a moment in my piece where you suggested that we stretch it out for 200% of the time. And I was like, yes, go for it. And it made my piece longer, which was great. And I didn't have to do anything. The player just had to double the time. And it was a really wonderful idea, and I incorporated it into my score.
I'm happy to hear that. So I try so hard not to put my ideas or my own feelings, but if you give all the musicians some freedom, then sometimes I feel like, okay, maybe even the conductor can say, hey, I feel like this, because I remember it was about the climax of the piece, and I just felt like it took a beautiful amount of time to arrive there, and then it felt a little too fast once we arrived there, the actual arrival. So I said, can we stretch it can we make it twice as long? And we tried it, and you liked it. So I'm happy you liked it and you still like it. It's important for me. It wasn't just a moment thing,
Yeah, I don't have a big ego about my music. I mean, when it comes to the stage, the musicians will do what they will anyway. So, and I love hearing the musicians' interpretations of my music. And I mean, I wouldn't be a composer otherwise. So yeah, thank you for suggesting things, and I encourage you to say more to other people as well.
Yeah. Gabriella, this is an interesting question, actually, because Peter just said this. Why are you a composer? I'm just curious.
Because that's what I got good at accidentally. No, well, I mean, yes, to some extent. I mean, I think it was just sort of what I got addicted to in a way as a kid. I remember I was, playing the violin and piano, and I just kind of started writing because I wanted to figure out how the music that I was playing came into existence. And so I tried writing something, and I think in my head it sounded like Bach. And when I heard it in real life, it sounded horrible and nothing like Bach. And so then I thought, oh, well, I should try again. And so I sort of just got really mesmerized by that process of trying, and then it being a little bit better than the last time, but still not quite right. And then I tried again and again and again. And that's essentially still what I'm doing. But going back to the last question, I actually just wanted to say that I really loved hearing both Peter and John, but especially John talking about aleatory, because I use it so much. And I completely agree with the way you were talking about giving freedom to the players and these amazing clusters that you could never get otherwise. And I mean, partly I started using those inspired by you and your music, John. So that was really great to hear you say that, because I can relate so much, and a lot of it came from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, very beautiful. And Gabriella, you also, because I've noticed this in your music, which I like, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And of course, actually, all three of you have done this. You write music that is not just about music, right? Like, you comment on things that are important to you. And of course, you all have done this, but can you talk a little bit about how do you, because I struggle with this myself. Like, I think that music of today should represent how we feel today and who we are today, but how does that music represent that? Like, how do you come across, and John, I'll come to you as well with the same question, like the statement that you made with the first symphony, for example. It's a deep personal statement, but it's also about the time that we live in, or the time that the struggles that we go through. And you have made these statements over and over, but Gabriella, how do you pick the things that you're touched by? Is it just an idea that comes to you, or something that you search for, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I think in many ways, my music is just about music at its core, but like, I think someone could hear it and not know what it's about, and get their own experience out of it. And I actually love that. I love telling people, like, you don't have to get this piece. You can just have your own understanding and experience of it. And I think that's really wonderful. But I think a lot of my music does come in other ways from being inspired by the natural world, just because that's been besides music, my other huge passion since I was a child. I actually meant to become an ecologist, and study the way ecosystems interact with each other, and climate change and stuff like that, conservation. And instead I went to music school. And but this passion hasn't left, and I still try to spend as much time outdoors as possible. And so I think music doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is inevitably influenced by the things around me. And that's what I think about all the time when I'm not thinking about music. And then the other aspect is, now that I'm writing music for people all over the world, I do have a platform and a voice to some extent, and I want to use that for good and to do something productive. And so when I write music about climate change, for example, that's what I'm trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, John, so as I was talking about, I mean, you've done several different things in your life about subjects that are deeply personal and things that we all experienced, but directly referencing the First Symphony, did that come at the beginning of the symphony, or the thought before the symphony, or was it in the process of the work that you wanted to, or how did that come about? I'm just curious.
Well, the First Symphony came about because I lost more than 100 people from my phone book to AIDS in the 80s. I wrote it in the late 80s. And my best friend, Sheldon Scholnick, who was a fantastic pianist and a fabulous musician, I was in Chicago in the hospital room when the doctor came in and told him that he had pneumocystis and he had AIDS. And he was going to die. In those days, it was death. And I had to go to Henry Fogel, the manager, and say, look, I'm going to write a memorial piece to my friends who have died and one who's dying and about AIDS. And I hope that you in the orchestra are not going to have any problem with it. And he said, we will back you up 100%. Because in those days, it was not an easy issue. The president never uttered the word AIDS, and it was quite a different issue than now, of course. So, I mean, the whole piece was conceived with the idea of the friends, the memories, rage and remembrance is the subtitle of the piece. And it's 45-minute work in which Shelley is in the first movement, played by an offstage piano, playing the piece the tango. It's a very hard piece for me even now, because memories of all these friends come, especially in the third movement. I kind of have a quilt where I memorialize friend after friend after friend after friend. And Bill Hoffman, my dear friend of 60 years, who wrote the libretto to the Boats of Versailles, he wrote epitaphs then. And I set the epitaphs and then removed the words because it's a symphony, and played the melodies in the oboe, the English one, or the French one. But there are other things. I mean, One Sweet Morning was commissioned by the Philharmonic for the 10th anniversary of 9/11. It's about war, and it's 4 poems about war, mezzo soprano and orchestra. And the last poem is about the end of war, and it's by Yip Harbour, who basically wrote musical comedies and one. What is it? Over the Rainbow? That movie. I'm forgetting it right now, but the famous Judy Garland movie, The Wizard of Oz.
Wizard of Oz.
But he wrote this gorgeous poem about the end of war, and I had to set that, and I told the Philharmonic that I would end with that and write three other from 3 different countries and 3 different eras about war, and that's what happened. And Circus Maximus is my big piece about the end of our society. And it's a scary piece because it celebrates and shows why you should be terrified of the technology that we're even speaking through now. It's a piece about ancient Rome, the Circus Maximus, that entertainment kind of kept everybody entertained and busy. There 260,000 people a day went to the Circus Maximus, way bigger than the Colosseum, every day for 1,000 years, from the beginning of Rome to the fall. And in the fall of Rome, when people were coming from the north and invading and all this was happening, the entertainments got more and more and more because the people who were running Rome were terrified, and the only thing they could do is give you more entertainment. And I think of our times with our iPhones and our screens and our 3,000 channels and kilowatts and all, and the suitcase bomb that also is a result of technology. So the piece actually ends with a shotgun blast, a real one, not a recording. And it's very, it's a big surround sound piece written for concert band that's augmented. Like there are 17 trumpets, very augmented, I would say. They surround the audience, and a marching band in the back of the audience, and a full band on the stage, and a saxophone quartet and bass over here, and French horns here, and trumpets, 11 trumpets ringing the audience in the first boxes. It's one of those pieces that surrounds you with fabulousness and yet terrifying. Like you're loving it, and at the same time you're realizing, and yet this could. So that's really the most political about what's happening to us. And yet I will write another piece that has nothing to do with that. A string quartet that is a string quartet. I mean, you can do both, I think, in this world. and certain things I'm passionate about, and I write about in music. Mr. Tambourine Man, Bob Dylan, 7 songs about, again, war, but also the in the 60s. And for soprano and orchestra, or soprano and piano, it was originally done for. Things like that. They usually turn out to be pretty long pieces. Awfully long. Tambourine Man is about 35, 37 minutes. And once I get started on a piece like that, like Circus Maximus, big, I just have to keep going on it until I really think it's big enough to say what it should say. But I like writing small things too, especially now.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of the music or the building, because I in my conversations with many composers, I feel like this is the one area where I feel like all composers, this is such a huge priority, because this could really make. It's not about just the beautiful musical language or the harmony or or just the message, but how do you build this together so it really makes sense? And I remember having a conversation. I've said this many times. People that have listened to me have heard me say it several times. But towards the end of his life, I had a private meeting with Maestro Boulez, and I asked him what was it that he was interested in music. Now, at this age, he was over 80 already. And I said, right now, what do you study? What are you interested in music? And he said, I try to understand structure. He said, it's the only thing that is interesting to me. And I said, but how do you do that? And he said, see, that's interesting. He said one thing that from a conductor's perspective, I find very true. And he said, structure reveals itself once every detail is understood in a piece of music, and you understand the bigger architecture once the tiny little details are comprehended. Which makes me think that perhaps from a composer's point of view, you make all those tiny little decisions informed by the structure or to inform the structure. This is John. You're waving.
I'm shaking my head because the tiny details get done as tiny details, which are the pitches and the rhythms and all that. The architecture is the whole piece. That's the most important thing. So I design the piece before I write the piece. Circus Maximus, I draw it on 11 by 17 pages, draw the shapes and indicate when things return, what are new, how you get to a climax, etc. Because we need to build our structures. We've gone away with the ones of the past, sonata form and rondos and variations. No, we have to make our own. Nietzsche said that, I believe, I'm trying to get this right, music is architecture frozen in the dimension of time. And really it is. Music is architecture, but it's in a different dimension. Instead of being, height and width and length and all that, it's in the dimension of time. And we have to be really clear about our architectures before we write, I think, for me. That's what I try to do with my students anyway, because that's the big decisions. Those are the real big decisions that get made. What do you want to do? It's the first question. How do you want to do it? Give me some ideas of where you want it to go. How does it begin? How does it end? Let's talk about these. Draw them out. Type out what they are before you write it in notes. The notes come later because you don't take an architect would not put a brick down or another brick and then say, I wonder if it's an office building or a house. And a sculptor would not take a 10,000 or 1,000 pound block of marble and chip away a finger and say, I wonder who that's attached to. Let me see. And those are the details Boulez is talking about. And yet, I don't think the finger with beautiful fingernail and all that is as important as the big structure. So I go from the out to in, the macro to the micro. I think is important to do because it's very hard to hear musical structure. What do you take you there? A composer and a conductor or musicians can take you to the climaxes and away from them, but the big structure is the hardest thing for the composer to do, and it's the hardest thing for the audience to understand. I mean, think of it this way. Guernica, that huge, wide, 17-foot, 10-foot high Guernica of Picasso. Roll it on 2 rollers, one full and one empty. Leave 5 inches space. Now, start rolling it, and in 25 or 30 minutes, you will roll the whole thing out. And ask somebody looking at that 5-inch space what they know. And the answer is nothing. And that's how we have to hear music, in time, moment by moment, remembering, thinking of what's before, thinking what's after. It's very hard. You have to be super clear. So my thing is architecture and clarity are the two things I want to know. Are you just, I mean, sometimes I look at scores with so many notes on them and I wonder, what is the main thing you're trying to do? Now, I have scores that I've peppered with notes too, but it's on the way or a reason for being because this is going to happen and it's leading to this. And that, I think, people follow, even though they don't understand it. I mean, I don't even understand Beethoven yet, and I've been studying him all my life, you know? I mean, yes, understanding music is really hard, but to make it clear and to think architecturally is, to me, the way to go.
Yeah.
People at Copeland said I get a motive and I go from there. And Copeland has great sense of architecture, but he did it another way. I not my way, but he's Aaron Copeland. I'm not knocking him. I think he's great. Just the way I believe. So Boulez is sculpting the finger or making the finger clear, while I'm saying who's it attached to. So we're not necessarily.
Right. Absolutely. Just because we have a quick question that came in, John, for you, and it might be a technical question, but it says, when you use controlled aleatory, how do you invent, or do you have to invent new notation that is comprehensible to the musicians?
Okay, the new notation is easy, much easier than standard notation, but they have to be taught. One of the problems with new notation is that a high school orchestra and the New York Philharmonic are approaching it the same way. What is this? And a lot of trained musicians don't like doing that because they can read a Boulez or sight read it at tempo. They're so skilled in standard notation. But give them something that is not standard and they say, I don't like this, you're making me a child. And yet, with those new notations, you can do things that you never could do any other way. So I say, if you can do it with standard notation, do it. But if you can't, and it has to go past that, do it. Invent a notation. There are some standard notations. I said the up cluster, the down cluster for, say, not strings, but say for something like pedal tones of the trombones or something. Yeah, but those are standard. But I have listened, I've learned a lot from the Penderecki of the 60s. He taught me alphabet that I incorporated. I mean, the Hiroshima notations for scrambling I use in the Piper Fantasy. I mean, I just say, there it is. It's perfect. Against it, I put something else, but that texture is exactly the right thing because he was smart and he knew how to make those things work. I had developed my own because in 1978 or 79, I wrote a film score called Altered States. It's a big film, very, Ken Russell directed it, and it was a Warner Brothers movie. And Ken wanted me to go crazy and do these wild things because it was a kind of science fiction going into the future thing. And I did. But a lot of it, I came back and I had a board which I composed on. And I wrote on the top of it, motion, sonority. I said, there's going to be so many notes that have to come here. What can I do as a simple thing, like a trill or a tremolo, that gets motion? And that's how I developed the play within the box, for example. So if you play within the box like that and get the scramble, no individual voice will be heard, but you'll hear this thing, and they can play it marcato, they can play it vibrissimo, piano or forte, and they can move one box to the other box, so it can actually move. And the players learn to do that, and it's really not hard. It's easier than anything they're doing with Schoenbergian notation. On the other hand, it's new for some of them. Now, the orchestras that play new music, like your orchestra, yeah, sure, they eat it up. But some of the major orchestras are not as familiar with that. And a lot of composers use standard notation now because it's computer friendly. This is not computer friendly. I have to write this I write by hand, everything. And I give it to my publisher and they go through this incredible project of putting it into Sibelius, even though I have my cueing system and my things that are my own. They managed to do it. You can, but you have to be much better than I could ever be. So, this is my this is what I use. that's that's what I use to write, and it's the only way you can do it with certain notations. You can't really. Then computers are not your friend. They're your friend for repeated things and pasted things and stuff like that. But honestly, if you want to really just break through the idea of notes and pitches and rhythms and go someplace else, sometimes you just have to lie on your back with a pillow under your head and dream, make it happen.
Absolutely. Peter, can I come back to you about this idea of the architecture and the structure of something that you write? How do you come up with this?
Yeah, my relationship to the overarching structure of a piece really depends on the piece. So my Cabrillo piece was about dealing with insomnia and how crazy and disorienting that can be. So it's really sort of antagonistically responding to structure because there's a lack of it when you can't sleep. So musically, there was a lot of pigments and flashes of disparate musical moments. But with that said, the structural integrity of that piece is held together by a string quartet, which acts as a countdown, which is a tool of Yoga Nidra, counting down from 10 to 0 repeatedly. And that makes a reappearance at the end to sort of tie in everything and the conceptual idea together. But the jagged structure of that piece in particular is directly in response to illustrating an honest depiction of insomnia. And that's, to me, it was a lack of structure. So that's just a particular piece that I thought about structure sort of, in that antagonistic way.
And every piece, have you ever had a piece where you tried to just say, okay, let me start at the beginning and see where this goes, and then the structure sort of starts to develop along the way, or I mean, just say, okay, I'm going to improvise as a composer. Actually, this is a good question for all three of you. Do you ever feel like, okay, I'm just going to improvise as a composer. I have no idea where the next note is leading. And this leads to another question that we have, but the idea that you're just writing something for fun and you have no idea what will happen when you wake up tomorrow. How do you feel about it? And what direction is it going in? Like improvising on an instrument rather than performing something already you decide it's going to happen. Gabriella, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with John a lot in that for me, the whole piece is all about structure for the most part. I even wrote a piece called f of x equals sine squared x minus 1 over x, which just maps the form of the piece, which is like this. And that's exactly the energy contour of the piece. And that's all it's about, is just it starts kind of low energy, quiet, and then builds and then decays and then builds again a lot at the end. And that's literally what the whole piece is about. But I mean, so most of my music is more towards that direction. But sometimes I will, like if I maybe don't have an idea for a structure, then I'll improvise or just see where an idea takes me. But then eventually, before that idea is too developed, then the structure will come to me and then I'll find where it fits naturally into the structure.
John, there was one more question here coming back to the new notation or to the freedom of aleatory, controlled aleatory, and it says, which I think it's basically an obvious answer, but do you think that the typographical choices inform interpretation by the musicians?
Say it again. The what?
Typographical choices inform interpretation by the musician.
Typographical choices.
I think what it refers to is the writing of what you do. The way that I understand it is this means that every performance that you have of the piece will be different from the one before, right? So it's never the same piece.
Well, that's absolutely true.
That's the idea, right?
Certain areas of the piece, not the whole piece.
Yes. Yeah.
Lack of control. Absolutely. That's the whole wonder of performance, isn't it? I mean, the whole wonder of performance is to have something new happen, not the same thing, to that you hear on a recording is exactly the same. There are many different ways, and we can give them, which I said, musicians are, they shine, they smile when they're given the opportunity to interpret themselves and put themselves into the piece. So we give them those chances now. I think all three of us, I think, agree that that's really essential, and it has been essential for some time in music, because there was a time when no freedom was given. A Boulez piece of a serialized, for example, there was absolutely no freedom given in anything. But I think in the 21st century, composers are thinking very differently about that and thinking, let's open up this body of musicians. Let's write something that we control to a certain degree, but in some areas we give freedoms. That's, I think, natural for all of us. I think the three of us have very similar ideas on that. But you should ask them.
Yes, and I think it's I mean, it's also an important thing to understand that different places in the world deal with this concept of the freedom and to where music is, because for me, conducting all over the world, I meet different expectations from different musicians, and I see it on both sides of the Atlantic, really, the comparison between American or European. Like it's a really interesting conversation that I always have about bringing American composers to Europe or bringing European composers to America. It's interesting because they have different expectations of what contemporary music is supposed to sound like, and I oftentimes fight with people, and I say, look, it's really not a bad thing to like what you hear. It's really this.
No.
So it's an interesting, but sometimes people, I think, feel like if they understand, if they connect emotionally to something that they hear, then it must not be the proper art that we are expecting, which is so sad.
That's the God-composer business.
Yes.
Starts with Wagner, the whole idea of the composer being a god. And if the god speaks to you, you can't understand it because he's God. So
Right.
anything you don't understand is actually elevated higher than things you do understand, which obviously is done by people and not gods. And I'm afraid that Europe is a little behind us in terms of growing out of that. That was a 20th century fixation that came from the 19th century. And I think, I know young composers today do not want that in America. In Europe, it's quite different. And we don't have a good exchange, which is a real shame. Europeans are just not interested in what we do, and we do a lot of European stuff here, but Europe has not really proved to be very interested in us. And it's a shame, because I think we could help them. I hate to say it sounds condescending, but I really do think we can help them understand that beauty is also a part of art, that joy is a part of art, that it's not all about angst. Not everything is about wringing your hands, and not everything is about sadness and despair. And that we can grow into the idea of music as it used to be, which is open to everything.
Well, that's so beautiful, the way that you put it. One of the things that one of my first concerts in Germany, actually, when I started in Cologne, there's so clear groups, where they say, well, contemporary music, we perform in these concerts. And then usually you have, unfortunately, a very limited audience, and it's just the diehard fans that want to go to these. So I really wanted to do Gabriella's piece. I wanted to do Field Guide, but it didn't fit on one of these new music concerts. And I said, forget it. I want to do it on a subscription concert. And they said, yeah, but this is new music. We can't do it on a subscription concert. And I said, no, it's music. It's not old. It's not new. It's music. I'm doing it. So I did it, and the audience loved it. And I said, see, like, what's wrong with that? Yeah, it's really strange. Gabriella, a question comes from you, and it says, do you incorporate the visual elements after you compose the music, or at the same time, or visual first?
I'm not sure what they mean.
I think it refers to the excerpt that is that we presented,
okay.
The music with
the cello
and all of this. Yeah.
Yeah, the music video. So the video was actually done by a really talented artist and also composer named Darian Donovan Thomas. So I didn't do any of that. The song was written totally before, just as a song. And then we met and collaborated with him quite recently, actually, within the last like 6 months. And he sent us instructions for me and the cellist for how to record ourselves, miming the song and the music, and then he combined it with some beautiful nature footage I'd taken in Iceland in a really artistic way that we were really happy with.
Very
but
cool.
I can't take credit for it.
And Peter, can you, so there's another question from before that I'm asking you. Actually, it's open to anyone. Have you ever collaborated with another composer in creating a piece? You know, and I'm referring, there are pieces, of course, you know, probably one of the most famous is the Fae Sonata. That was a collaboration between Brahms, you know, as a present for Joachim visiting. You know, Dietrich, Schumann, and Brahms, you know, wrote this piece together. Each one wrote a movement. You know, so in this sense, like, have you ever considered or collaborated with another composer on something like that, just for fun?
Yeah, I'm totally open to that idea, and I think that this goes back to sort of what John was saying about composer as being God, and you know, we think of composers as being, you know, geniuses, and I certainly don't fit into that theory. And so yeah, I'm totally open to that, and I love collaborating with people. And actually, one of the pieces that I shared with the Cabrillo audience, called Screaming Shapes, is an incredibly collaborative process with musicians who are also composers. And I took little snippets of them responding to poetry, and so they were composing on top of this poetry, and I took what they had made out of that, and I composed on top of that. So I guess that is, in a way, not so directly, but a collaborative process with other composers.
You collaborated with Ravel, I saw, very beautifully. The Ravel Miroir.
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess it's not so much of an actual collaboration, because they have no say in what I do with their music, but I did respond to a work of Ravel's, and I respond to a lot of other composers, and it's just my way of communicating with them. And whether they like it or not, I don't want to know, because they're dead. But it's, yeah, I love that process.
Yeah, but it is a beautiful idea that you could have a, maybe not a conversation, but a commentary on something that someone else did 200 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50 years ago, you know, which is why I think people try to think of composers as God, also to the idea that it brings a sense of immortality to what you do, what you leave behind. And I think it's a beautiful gift that you give the world as a composer, that you give a part of yourself. And this comes back to that courage that we were talking about at the beginning, John, you know, because it takes a lot of courage to give a part of yourself and of your skill and your life, really, you know, you leave behind forever. You leave it to other people, for other people to be able to enjoy. And then perhaps 100 years later, there will be another person that is inspired by what you wrote to comment on it. You know, I think that's such a beautiful thing, you know, to think of this, connection that we make with people, not just on a daily basis, you know, but across time, in the same way that we still listen to Beethoven. John, you said you're still studying Beethoven and trying to learn what he did, you know, and the only reason why, it's because you feel connected to him in some way, you know. There's something that makes you want to know Beethoven, and I think it's a beautiful medium that music is. Not to mention the fact that it sounds beautiful, and it makes us happy, and it makes us feel emotions, and it makes us deepen the way that we feel emotion as well. And it's an intellectual enlightenment as well, you know, with it. So I think if you want to we have just a couple more minutes and look at that. We've spent an hour talking about music and art and beautiful things. If there's something that you want to say, just as a small little memory from Cabrillo, I really hope that we will be able to be in person soon and to see you all. But if there's something specifically that you want to say hello to our devoted fans, your devoted fans in Cabrillo, now you have the time. John, do you want to go first? You seem...
Sure. Well, come to Cabrillo for live music. You can also, in front of the theater beforehand, they sell boiled artichokes that are come just from the field, right down in Castroville or Castro, whatever it's called, and they're so beautiful. And while you're eating those and relaxing in your comfortable clothing, they're preparing to do a great concert, and you're going to go in and be surprised, which is the best thing about going to new music. But you always be surprised and you don't know, hey, there's an E flat chord, now there's a second one. Oh, it's the Eroica Symphony. I know how the next part goes. You don't know what the next part goes. Isn't that great? Conductor raises his baton, and it's a surprise. I always look forward to that moment when the baton comes down, and anything can happen. And isn't that great? So that's what the fear is all about, and I love it.
Thank you, John. Gabriella?
There's so many great things about Cabrillo. I mean, I love that it's just so casual. I think so many people have this barrier with classical music because they feel like it's fancy and they're not fancy, and so they can't appreciate it. But Cabrillo doesn't feel like that at all. And also Santa Cruz is just one of my favorite places. I grew up in the Bay Area, so not too far. And I wrote my first piece for Cabrillo in 2014 was called Tumblebird Contrails. And it was about the Pacific Ocean, among other things. And people came up to me at the end and really seemed to get it because they live on the Pacific Ocean and commented, "You really get the Pacific Ocean." So that was fantastic.
Peter?
Yeah, I'm moving to the Bay Area in a month, so I'm looking forward to being a little closer to Santa Cruz and going to Cabrillo again. And one of my favorite memories was after the concert, just talking to the incredible audience members who were so curious and so excited. So many people had questions or comments or wanted to talk about their own experience with insomnia, and then going to that amazing Mediterranean restaurant. Is it Lily or Layli? I think, is it still there? It's so good. I want to go back.
Yes, John, we had lunch there, I remember.
I do. I love the town. It's a beautiful town, and the people there are fantastic, and they love your music, new music and new people. It's great.
Yeah, great. Well, I couldn't have asked for a better advertisement for what we do for the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music, where we present composers like you, John, Gabriella, and Peter. And I invite everyone to come and hear us live when we'll be able to open up again. But in the meantime, I thank you all so much for giving your time, for giving us, of course, your beautiful music. And we can't wait to see you again very soon.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you.